It is the 80th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II, and there is plenty of military news to cover today. National Guardsmen heading for the Windy City, Navy warships off the coast of Venezuela actually launching an attack on a drug boat, and military parades in China. I'm Elizabeth Vargas, and America's news starts right now.
Tonight,
look, I have an obligation. This isn't a political thing.
President Trump is planning his Chicago takeover as he trumpets what's been happening in Washington, D.C.
We don't have a crime problem in Washington anymore, and the mayor has been very helpful.
Local Democrats are up in arms, but after 58 shootings and 8 people killed just this Labor Day weekend, one Chicago Democrat thinks help is a good thing. Then, the FDA Commissioner Marty Makary is here to explain the FDA's decision to revoke the emergency authorization for COVID booster vaccines. It's a decision that puts Makary right in the middle of the battle between the CDC and Health Secretary RFK Jr. as the president weighs in. And later, as we remember the 80th anniversary of Japan's World War II surrender, America's enemies gather in China to unite for a military parade. It's all smiles and handshakes, but is another Asian storm front on the horizon?
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Plenty to get to, but we begin tonight in Chicago, where after a bloody Labor Day weekend, the nation's third largest city is now bracing for a federal takeover. A surge in federal immigration enforcement is expected to hit the Windy City as soon as this week. And President Trump says it's only a matter of time before he sends in the National Guard.
Well, we're going in. I didn't say when. We're going in. When you lose, look, I have an obligation. This isn't a political thing. I have an obligation.
Trump's vow to send in the National Guard to Chicago comes after citywide shootings killed 8 people and injured 50 others over the holiday weekend. The president highlighted that violence today, saying Chicago has become a, quote, hellhole and, quote, the murder capital of the world. The Windy City does have the highest number of murders, but there are actually 20 American cities with higher murder rates. Trump said Democratic Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker should do the right thing and call him to save the city.
I would love to have Governor Pritzker call me. I'd gain respect for him and say, we do have a problem, and we'd love you to send in the troops because you know what? The people, they have to be protected.
Well, here's how Governor Pritzker responded to that.
I'm aware that the President of the United States likes to go on television and beg me to call and ask him for troops. I find this extraordinarily strange, as Chicago does not want troops on our streets. I also have experience asking the President for assistance, just to have the rug pulled out from underneath me when execution meets reality. I refuse to play a reality game show with Donald Trump again.
The debate over more deployments comes after a federal judge in California ruled today that Trump broke the law when he sent thousands of National Guard troops to Los Angeles in June. A judge ruled he violated the Posse Comitatus Act, a long-standing federal law that prohibits the military from acting as law enforcement. But the resistance is not unanimous. Over in Washington, D.C. today, Mayor Bowser issued an order to continue a public safety partnership with the federal government after Trump's 30-day emergency expires. And if Trump has a message for Pritzker and other Democratic leaders, it's to be more like Mayor Bowser.
So Mayor Bowser's been great, and we don't have a crime problem in Washington anymore. And the mayor has been very helpful, and the police commissioner has been very helpful, and it's been a great team.
Let's go now to NewsNation's Alex Capriello, live for us on the streets of Chicago. Alex, first of all, it's a very different situation in Washington, D.C. than it is in the state of Illinois. Governor Pritzker says there's no emergency in Chicago that requires Trump's intervention, but that number of shootings this Labor Day weekend, that was quite high.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, Elizabeth. It was a brutally violent Labor Day weekend, even surpassing the numbers that we saw last year. But when we heard from both Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker as well as Mayor Brandon Johnson earlier today, they both say that crime is under control here in the city. For that reason, they don't feel as if President Trump needs to follow through on this threat of actually sending federal agents to the Windy City. But our NewsNation sources have already confirmed that there are agents from the Department of Homeland Security, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, as well as Customs and Border Protection that are actually leaving Los Angeles and heading to Chicago as we speak. In fact, this is a big differentiation that we need to make, because there's a difference between ICE agents and the National Guardsmen, because we know, at least constitutionally, it's up to the Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker to actually call in the Illinois National Guard. However, we heard earlier today that Pritzker believes that Texas National Guardsmen are actually on their way here to Chicago. At the very same time, Governor Pritzker right now has a message for all of Chicagoans and Illinoisans, for that matter, saying that it's important that everyone that disagrees with this actually peacefully protest. Peaceful is the main word there, because he doesn't want to see any sort of opportunity for President Trump to follow through and use this moment to actually send in the National Guard. Take a listen to Governor Pritzker.
The Trump plan is to use any excuse to deploy armed military personnel to Chicago. If someone flings a sandwich at an ICE agent, Trump will try and go on TV and declare an emergency in Chicago. I'm imploring everyone, if and when that happens, do not take the bait.
So back to what we saw this Labor Day weekend. 8 people are now dead here in Chicago as a result of shootings. More than 30 shooting investigations are now underway. Nearly 60 people were shot. And President Trump really capitalizing on this opportunity by calling it the murder capital of the world. But NewsNation research teams have actually looked at the most recent statistics from the FBI. And as you rightfully pointed out, Elizabeth, Chicago doesn't even crack the top 10 when it comes to murders per capita. And when you look at the state of Illinois as a whole, it's not even ranked within the top 28. It's ranked number 29, and that comes behind several states, including red-leaning states, Alaska, Louisiana, New Mexico, Arkansas, as well as Tennessee. Elizabeth?
All right, Alex Capriello live in Chicago for us. Let's get reaction now from Chicago Alderman Raymond Lopez. Great to have you here, Alderman. So, Illinois Senator Dick Durbin said this afternoon that sending the National Guard would be, quote, an unconstitutional abuse of power. The governor, as you heard, just said that none of this is about fighting crime or making Chicago safer. It's just a big show. What's your reaction to those comments?
I think everyone on all sides, Elizabeth, has been putting on a big show for the better part of 2 weeks now. We know that there's a perception that people are not safe in the city of Chicago. Residents do not feel safe in the city of Chicago. They're worried when they drop their kids off at school, when they go to work, when they sit on their front porches looking in and admiring the summertime weather. Everyone's worried that they're going to be robbed, carjacked, or shot in the city of Chicago. And if the mayor and the governor continue to say crime is down, crime is decreasing, everything's great, then why don't we take Donald Trump up on his offer and go even further, decrease the numbers even further, the way that they've been decreased in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I don't think anybody's saying everything's great. I think they're just saying it's not as bad as the president is saying it is. It's not a hellhole or a killing field.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with the president's comments that we're the worst, the murder capital of the world, but
well,
we do have our
false.
challenges. Yes, arguably and provably false. But at the same time, we do know that many of our residents live in a state of fear, a state of panic and anxiety about the crime that they perceive all around them. We had 2 young teenagers shot in my ward on the same day that Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson said we don't need help. Of course we need help. We need the actual presence of the National Guard to focus on the assets of the city so that our police can go into the communities and go after those individual gang members, drug dealers, and human traffickers that we know are here, and use the full force of government to go after them. That is absolutely something we should be working towards.
Yeah, you said it's, quote, absolutely asinine that your Democratic colleagues aren't saying, okay, bring in the Guard. My question to you is, what do you want the National Guard to do, given the legal restrictions?
Look, we don't expect the National Guard to focus on policing. We know that's constitutionally impossible. But what they can do is provide uniform presence at some of our city's assets, like the Buckingham Fountain, Navy Pier, Magnificent Mile, where we currently have police officers who could be patrolling neighborhoods, sitting around in their beat cars for 8 hours a day. Those officers should be in neighborhoods focusing on those magnets of violence that we know, while we let the National Guard protect the art museum. That's perfectly fine with me.
You had a terribly high number of shootings just this past weekend in Chicago, 58. The mayor of Chicago said this afternoon that it was guns that were to blame, and he then went on to blame red states for this problem, for selling the guns to criminals in Chicago. As he put it, quote, "For every murder in Chicago, there's a gun trafficker in Mississippi who is profiting off our pain." What do you make of that?
You know, I'm actually quite surprised he didn't blame the Confederacy, Richard Nixon, or colonialism for why we have all the problems in the city of Chicago, because those are also his go-tos. We have serious problems with individuals who are committed to a lifestyle that only leads in death and destruction. We've seen where 2,000 high-priority targets were shipped here from Texas who were granted asylum at the border by the previous administration, who they vetted and identified as threats not only to our city, but to our country. And we have missed every opportunity to work with the federal government to remove those individuals from our streets. Now, rather than signing a protection order against the federal government, we should be working with Donald Trump to see how we can find some commonality and focusing on how to make Chicago streets safe again.
Trump said this afternoon that he wants Governor Pritzker to call him. Today, Governor Pritzker said the Illinois State Police got a call, but here's the problem. You know, we've got Trump saying, "I want Pritzker to call me," and Pritzker saying, "Nobody's called me." I mean, it's a simple thing. You know, you can get on the phone and talk, right?
You know, Bell learned that phones work both ways for receiving and placing calls, and we need to know how to do that as well. It's shameful, really, because that's what actually is driving a lot of the concern with what we're seeing going on, is that this is all a political performance on both sides. Because either one of these two leaders, or three leaders, if you include Brandon Johnson, could easily communicate with the other and say, what do we need to do to make this right? How can we mitigate what we're going to see over the next few weeks? And how can we coordinate our efforts? But none of the three want to do that. They'd rather get into these social media TikTok battles with each other, arguing over who's the worst threat to democracy. And all the while, the people of Chicago, those who are most impacted by violence on the south and west sides and in neighborhoods at all points in between, have nowhere to go and no answers from the leaders that they've elected.
And finally, we did have confirmation, NewsNation did, that there are apparently ICE agents who are on their way to Chicago as we speak. ICE agents are moving in, but not the National Guard. All the conversation here has been about crime and the murders in Chicago. Most of those crimes are committed by American residents living in Chicago, gang members in Chicago, drug dealers in Chicago. They're not being committed by illegal immigrants, at least the vast majority of them. ICE agents are on the way. You say you want the National Guard there, not ICE agents, or both?
Well, I've already led the charge to allow our police officers to work with federal
ICE.
Immigration officers, yes, when individuals who are non-citizens choose to engage in specific dangerous criminal activities. We also know, as I said earlier, that the Biden administration allowed over 2,000 individuals whom they vetted, who were identified as serious dangers not only to our city, but to our country, to be allowed to come to the city of Chicago. So if ICE can work to identify those individuals who are also the groundswell of where the human trafficking and drug sales are coming from, then so be it. That they'd be more than welcome in our communities.
All right, Alderman Raymond Lopez, representing the 15th Ward of Chicago, which is on the west side of Chicago, a Democrat, I might point out. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
All right, Chicago's violence problem, as we said, is tied to gang violence and drugs. And as part of the Trump administration's crackdown on drug cartels, the United States has sent warships off the coast of Venezuela. And it appears this was not merely an exercise in saber rattling. The president just announced that the American military has destroyed a Venezuelan narco boat.
Over the last few minutes, literally shot out a boat, a drug-carrying boat, a lot of drugs in that boat. There's more where that came from. We have a lot of drugs pouring into our country.
That was this afternoon. Secretary of State Marco Rubio then confirmed it all, saying that a lethal strike had been carried out in the Caribbean against a vessel operated by a narco-terrorist organization. This comes just days after a guided missile cruiser named the USS Lake Erie arrived off the coast of Venezuela. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who still has a $50 million bounty on his head, says Trump is, quote, seeking to enact regime change. He also said his country was ready to strike back if attacked. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is headed to Mexico to talk to officials about drugs and illegal immigration. Those talks are likely to be awkward. Trump has not ruled out striking the cartels on their home turf. And Secretary Rubio himself has accused the Mexican government of allowing drug cartels to take over whole parts of that country. NewsNation's Joe Khalil is live for us at the White House tonight. Joe, if the president's willing to send the National Guard into Chicago, is it a stretch to imagine him sending commandos into Mexico?
Well, what the White House has talked about are strikes potentially inside the borders and territories of other countries, some adversarial countries like Venezuela and some allied countries like Mexico. And they have not ruled that out yet, which is an interesting point. This was really extraordinary what happened today, Elizabeth. Remember, at the beginning of President Trump's second term, one of the first things he did was designate a whole bunch of drug cartels as terrorist organizations. And what that does is it opens up a whole new menu of options for the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, to treat cartels like they would treat terrorist organizations. And that is exactly what we saw today with the first lethal strike on a Venezuelan boat that Secretary of State Rubio says was a drug-related boat. It was a drug operation. And this is what else he said here, basically hinting that this is not going to stop.
So the president's been very clear that he's going to use the full power of America and the full might of the United States to take on and eradicate these drug cartels, no matter where they're operating from and no matter how long they've been able to act with impunity. Those days are over.
So, Elizabeth, for the past couple of weeks now, the force posture around Venezuela and in the Caribbean has increased dramatically. Right now, the Pentagon confirms that they've got 7 naval ships in the region, 2 of them destroyers, and that may continue. You mentioned that the response from President Nicolas Maduro is that he says he may put his own country on a war footing. His words were that he's ready to constitutionally declare a republic in arms. And he said he is not ruling out deploying some 4.5 million troops in his own country to be ready near their own borders there. So there is an obvious escalation here, and that may be something that the DOD, the Pentagon, has to consider. But again, you just heard from Secretary Rubio, they will continue to go after cartels in this way, in that remarkable video that you're seeing now.
Yeah, we're watching it now. It's the video that they just released of the strike on that drug boat. It doesn't look like it's a very big boat, but who knows what it's carrying. The point here, though, is the boat was in international waters, right? They have yet, even despite this massive military presence, they've yet to strike inside Venezuela.
That's exactly right. And although they haven't ruled it out, they haven't done it yet. That's what would be extraordinary. And that's actually what has made Mexican officials nervous, per our sources that we've talked to, because they feel that this is a serious possibility, the cartels operating there. I've heard from several senators, some allies of President Trump, that they want to see the Mexican government be more of a partner, but that if they do not do that, if they don't act with the United States, then the Trump administration is not going to hesitate to take action against Mexican cartels with or without the support of the Mexican government.
Extraordinary. All right, Joe Khalil reporting on that really unusual development, to put it mildly, today. Were COVID vaccines a medical marvel that saved millions of lives? Or, as some allege, a scientific scam? The CDC is currently being ripped apart debating this, even as most medical experts say the evidence is clear that the vaccines worked. In his first public comments since CDC Director Susan Monarez was ousted last week, President Trump is pushing pharmaceutical companies to back up their claims about their COVID drugs and vaccines. Trump wrote on Truth Social in part, quote, "It is very important that drug companies justify the successes of their various COVID drugs. I have been shown information from Pfizer and others that is extraordinary, but they never seem to show those results to the public. Why not?" Remember, COVID vaccines were developed during Trump's first term in Operation Warp Speed. He has touted this, and not without justification, as one of his greatest achievements ever. But as Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. overhauls the CDC and the FDA, access to a COVID vaccine today is more limited than it was 4 years ago. The FDA recently narrowed its criteria for who qualifies for the vaccine. So most people now can no longer walk into their neighborhood's CVS or Walgreens and get the shot. You need to first go to a doctor and get a prescription. And if you do get it, you may have to pay the roughly $150 out of pocket if your insurance no longer covers it because of this new restriction. Kennedy's critics say he is waging a war on science. Well, here to respond in part is FDA Commissioner Dr. Marty Makary. Great to have you back on the show. So President Trump says he has seen information from Pfizer that is extraordinary, as he calls it, but that hasn't been made public. What exactly is he talking about?
Well, I can tell you, Elizabeth, that we just came out of an era where science was used as political propaganda, and we have not had updated data on the COVID vaccine in the randomized control trial fashion that the FDA typically requires in 4 or 5 years. Well, it's a very different time now. We have broad population immunity. It's a different virus. And yes, when Operation Warp Speed was conducted, you had a vaccine that was a very good match with the circulating strain at the time and low levels of natural immunity. But what about today? Does a 12-year-old girl need 60 more COVID shots in her average lifespan? If we're being honest, the answer is we don't know. And the medical community has not shown that humility to say that.
But what is this information that Trump is saying that he's seeing that the public is not seeing? Because he's demanding that drug companies now justify the success of the vaccines because, as he's put it, many people think they're a miracle and others disagree. Then he wrote, the CDC is being ripped apart over this question. So is the CDC and the FDA not getting the information that Trump is getting on the COVID vaccine?
Well, I can only speak for myself, Elizabeth, and when I see data presented to me, it is often salami sliced and cut and subgroups, and it's an observational study, not a proper clinical trial. So what I can report to you is that we have an agreement now with the large vaccine makers that make the COVID vaccine that they will conduct a randomized control placebo trial and have those results back to us by May. That is, they're going to do it this winter because it's been 4 or 5 years and the American people want to know, are we supposed to keep going like this?
Right.
A lot of people report vaccine injury. A lot of people report complications, including children who have died from the vaccine. So we can't just be blind. We are collecting all the data that we have that's been reported to the FDA and CDC through the VAERS database, and we're also asking the companies to go do this trial in healthy subjects because we think that is a different group than high-risk individuals where we narrowed the label indication, which renders vaccine mandates legally impossible.
But we should note that vaccine injury and, God forbid, vaccine deaths have been a very, very small minority of the hundreds of millions of people who've taken this vaccine.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans describe vaccine injury. 25% of clinicians know of somebody that's been significantly disabled or died from a vaccine. I know of 3 people who have died from the COVID vaccine, not personally, but through a physician or friend that has had a first-degree contact with someone who has had a vaccine complication. We know there's a risk of myocarditis in young, healthy men. That's 1 in 2,600 young boys. So, when people use these blanket terms, they're ignoring the very nuanced question in medical science, and that is, do the benefits outweigh the risks? That is the question. Not let's blindfold ourselves and insist that everybody take this. Look at the last administration, rubber stamping COVID boosters every year with no updated clinical trial. And we said we're not going to keep going down this road. We don't believe in COVID vaccine boosters forever unless we have evidence to support it. We're bringing back gold standard science and common sense.
Both the American Academy of OBGYN doctors and the American Academy of Pediatrics, quote, strongly disagree with the new guidelines. The president of the Infectious Disease Society said, quote, the FDA has made a decision that completely contradicts the evidence and severely undermines trust in science-driven policy. I want to get your reaction to that.
Well, first of all, let's remember the American Academy of Pediatrics insisted schools stay shut for nearly 2 years and supported the recommendation of the CDC in their document edited by the teachers union that allowed schools to stay shut for nearly 2 years. That was an American tragedy, and there's been little discussion of that incredible generational mistake that they made. There have been other mistakes, but look, if they want to put out their own recommendation, that is something we should welcome. It's a free country. Doctors should be able to express their opinion. We believe in scientific discourse, not censorship like the last administration. And we're not going to have expert panels where they are like-minded individuals. Like in the last ACIP committee under the Biden administration, they fired Harvard's Dr. Martin Kulldorff for disagreeing. At the FDA, they fired the 2 top vaccine experts at the FDA in the Biden administration for disagreeing, for disagreeing on the COVID booster in children. I mean, you talk about censorship. We are encouraging an open dialogue.
Okay, but I think RFK Jr. has just fired a lot of people who disagree with his positions on vaccines. Is that not also the case? I mean, isn't that just continuing? Look, the shoe's on the other foot now?
We now have a ACIP committee with a diverse group of scientific experts, not a monolithic group that locks arms and walks off a cliff together like they did in pushing for annual boost. They want a 12-year-old girl today to get a 7th booster shot. There was no evidence for that. Now there's a diverse group of people, and they're, you know, I hear, oh, they're anti-vaxxers. You have guys on there like the former head of infectious diseases at Tufts Children's Hospital. So this is a distinguished group, and now you are going to actually have a discourse around science, not just a political narrative.
Dr. Marty McCary, hope you'll come back. This is going to be a big month for ACIP and that big decision on the new vaccine recommendations, and you're always welcome here to come and explain it all and break it down for our audience. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it, Elizabeth.
All right, coming up for us, President Trump and Vladimir Putin are escalating their war of words as the Russian president attends a summit. No, not that one, a very different one. This one's in China now. He's spending a lot of time on the world stage, this Putin. Could this be the beginning of the end for any kind of hope for a ceasefire in Ukraine? We are live in Kyiv next. And don't forget, you can download our NewsNation app for the very latest news on the top stories of the night.
Now, as you leave this place, remember it, remember the words, and tell it to your friends, and tell them to experience this place, and tell them to experience us, to touch our hands, and then say to them that we gave up our yesterdays for their tomorrows, and we thank them for the privilege. And if they say to you, who spoke those words, tell them it was a 16-year-old boy in the heart and mind of a 97-year-old veteran of World War II. God bless you.
Wow. A 16-year-old boy who went on to serve his country. An emotional speech from World War II veteran Dave Yoho at today's ceremony commemorating the end of World War II. 80 years ago today, Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, putting an end to the deadliest conflict in human history. World War II left 85 million people dead, a majority of them civilians. Today's wars don't typically end with unconditional surrenders on the decks of battleships. However, Donald Trump would accept almost any deal that can be called peace in Ukraine right now. That goal, however, is proving as elusive as ever. President Trump says he's, quote, disappointed in Russian President Vladimir Putin as the war in Ukraine grinds on with no peace deal, no end in sight. It appears Putin has moved on from his coy yes, no, maybe word games with Trump, at least for the moment. He's in China meeting with President Xi Jinping and North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un. As he often does when traveling abroad, Putin was as gracious and flattering to his hosts as he was in Alaska last month, calling President Xi his dear friend and touting his country's unprecedentedly high level of ties with China. So what happened to the big meeting between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States? NewsNation's Robert Sherman is live in Kyiv. Robert, Trump does not appear to be thrilled by this meeting in China, and I think everyone can understand why.
Yeah, we've heard rather explicitly not thrilled at all with Russia's behavior in recent weeks. We've heard that from the administration. It is now crunch time here, Elizabeth. This is the time span in which the president said Russia's got to move towards peace or there will be consequences. He reaffirmed that today when asked by reporters and said this. Take a listen.
Have you spoken with President Putin?
Yeah, I don't want to. I have learned things that will be very interesting. I think in the next few days you'll find out.
Will there be any consequences if there isn't some type of announcement of a meeting with President Putin and President Zelensky?
Yeah,
and what?
But the Russians are saying they never agreed to anything of the kind. Yuri Ushakov, who is a senior aide to the Kremlin, especially on foreign policy, spoke with Russian reporters and said this. Now they're talking about a trilateral meeting, about a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. But specifically this, as far as I know, there was no agreement between President Putin and President Trump. With President Zelensky saying tonight that he believes Russia is negotiating dishonestly. Take a listen.
The Russians literally denied what President Trump said about the leaders' meeting that is needed to end the war. These days in China, Putin keeps spinning his tales.
When it comes to what comes next, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying all options are on the table. Elizabeth?
All options, meaning sanctions if they're coming from the Treasury Secretary. Let's see if it actually happens. There's been that bill in Congress languishing for quite some time. A lot of Republican support for more sanctions on Russia. Robert Sherman reporting live from Ukraine. Thank you so much. Coming up for us, back to our top story. What does one of the leading voices in the conservative movement think about President Trump's crackdown on crime? Chris Cuomo is about to ask Ben Shapiro that. A preview of the conversation coming up next. All right, Chris and I have been talking nonstop in the commercial break. You're about to have a wide-ranging conversation with conservative commentator Ben Shapiro. You're talking crime and COVID and Jeffrey Epstein. I don't even know where to start. I was just telling you that one of my sons actually sometimes listens to Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, it's because he's a critical thinker.
Yeah.
And that's the way you guys raised him. And that's a good thing. Shapiro is a provocative guy.
He questions a lot.
Sure, and around a lot of young men especially, strong opinions that reinforce certain aspects of identity and of politics and of culture are very respected. And Shapiro is a hell of a businessman. Now, I believe that the reason for this segment is because conversation is the cure. It does not matter what he and I agree about. It is how we choose to disagree. And coming off the top, I'm going to give Ben a lot of ammo because I want to talk about something that I believe is the biggest thing that the president has put on the table that is being ignored. And then I have the head of the NIH, which will be a spicy conversation. But I believe that we have a chance, Elizabeth, to get to a much better place of cultural acceptance of truth around the pandemic. And that's what I'm excited about tonight.
All right, I'm excited to hear it.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.